The gurney hit the double doors hard enough to throw one of them against the wall. Dr. Daniel Reeves was pushed through behind it. 4 men followed. 2 carried guns. The patient was in his 60s, his shirt dark beneath a bandage. Vincent Moretti, the dark-haired man said. 1 gunshot. Save him. A 5th man pressed an access card to the fire door panel. Steel doors sealed both ends of the corridor. Open them, Daniel said. When he leaves alive. Daniel reached for the wall phone. Dead. Above it, the security camera was dark. On the access panel, an override clock had already been running for 11 minutes. The gurney had arrived less than 3 minutes ago. Someone had prepared the hospital for them. Daniel looked at the weapons surrounding his hands. If you want him alive, get every gun away from my table. Nobody moved. Vincent Moretti opened his eyes and lifted 2 fingers. It was barely a gesture, but the guns lowered. Daniel stepped beside the gurney. How long since he was shot? 19 minutes. Who handled him after he fell? The dark-haired man hesitated. Daniel looked down at Vincent's failing pulse. That hesitation may kill him. Start talking. I'm Elias Mercer, and tonight's story begins. Quietly, with a surgeon who believed a hospital was the one place where even violence had to obey his rules. By sunrise, Dr. Daniel Reeves would learn that rules meant very little when the wrong men already possessed the keys. 3 hours before Vincent Moretti entered St. Catherine's on a stolen gurney, the West Trauma Corridor was empty, brightly lit, and ordinary. Daniel passed its locked doors without giving them more than a glance. He had other things on his mind. 14 hours into his shift, Daniel stopped a resident from sending an elderly man upstairs under the wrong diagnosis. Start again, Daniel told him. The resident blinked. His tests are negative. I didn't ask what the tests said. I asked what changed after he got here. The answer was hidden in a small detail. The man could no longer fasten his shirt. Daniel redirected the case, then moved on. At St. Catherine's, people trusted him because he was careful, not because he performed miracles. At 11:18 that night, he finally checked his phone. Claire had left a voicemail 12 minutes earlier. They said we should have the decision by morning, she said. Her voice was steady, though he could hear the effort behind it. Don't call from the middle of a case. Just come home when you can. Claire went quiet. He heard a glass touch the kitchen counter. I saved you some soup. It may be terrible by breakfast. Daniel listened twice. For 6 weeks, their insurer had been reviewing Claire's treatment. Every call produced a new form or another committee. The treatment center had an opening. They did not have approval to pay for it. He typed, I promise we will make it work. Then he deleted the promise. I'll be home before breakfast. We'll face whatever they say. He sent it and slipped the phone into his coat. On the workstation, a notice read, West Trauma Corridor closed for renovation. Daniel noticed the smaller line beneath it. The electronic security test had been moved from the following Tuesday to that night. Dr. Evelyn Shaw's name appeared at the bottom. The chief medical operations officer signed dozens of changes every week. Daniel had no reason to think this one mattered. He found a maintenance employee near the nurse's station. Did your team move the West Wing test? The man shook his head. Came from upstairs, I guess. Nobody tells us anything until a door stops opening. A nurse named Helen looked over from the desk. Speaking of doors, the service elevator keeps stopping on 4. Renovation crew? No crew tonight. Before Daniel could ask more, a call came from treatment 6. A patient's breathing had changed. He returned to the work in front of him, and the elevator slipped out of his thoughts. Near midnight, the emergency department filled after a collision. Daniel moved from room to room, answering questions and correcting orders. At 41 minutes after midnight, the charge nurse handed Daniel a pager. Biomedical alarm in the old trauma wing. Call the technician. We did. He says the alert isn't from any monitor still registered to the hospital. Daniel stared toward the closed fire doors. Then what exactly is alarming? That, Helen said, as a muted electronic tone sounded behind the wall. The department needed every nurse. Daniel took the master badge. If I'm not back in 5 minutes, call security. Helen smiled. You're checking a monitor, Daniel. Then I'll be back in 4. He crossed the hall alone, unaware that hospital security would receive no call at all. Daniel opened the west wing doors and entered a corridor that smelled of plaster and disinfectant. Half the ceiling tiles were missing. Plastic sheeting covered the old nurse's station. The alarm stopped. Biomedical? Daniel called. No answer. He checked the first procedure room. The lights were on, though renovation power should have been reduced. An old monitor glowed beside an empty table. Its screen displayed no patient information, only a pulsing amber warning. Behind him, the service elevator chimed. The doors opened on two men wearing Navy paramedic jackets. One jacket strained across the man's shoulders. The other hung past his wrists. They pushed out a gurney without a hospital tag. A dark-haired man in a black coat walked beside them. Daniel stepped toward the fire door. Another man appeared behind him and pressed a white access card to the panel. The lock engaged with a heavy click. Daniel lifted his pager. Its screen had gone blank. "Give me my phone line," he said. The dark-haired man removed Daniel's cell phone from his coat and set it on the covered nurse's station. "You'll get it back. You're inside a hospital with a wounded man. If you want help, start telling the truth." Gunshot. 19 minutes ago, he spoke in the car. Name? The man looked at him. Vincent Moretti. Daniel knew the name. Anyone who watched the evening news in Philadelphia knew it. Moretti owned restaurants, construction firms, and half a dozen businesses reporters always described as legitimate. 3 federal investigations had ended without charges. Daniel did not have time to care about any of that. Move him into the procedure room. One of the false paramedics reached beneath his jacket. "Not with that," Daniel said. "You can carry the patient or carry the gun. Pick one." The dark-haired man nodded, and the weapon disappeared. As they moved Vincent, a narrow man in a gray suit came close to the gurney. There was blood on his cuff. "Did he say anything?" the man asked. "Back up," Daniel said. "I asked if he spoke." The dark-haired man turned. "He heard you, Paul." Paul stepped away, but his attention remained on Vincent's face. Inside the room, Daniel found fresh packages arranged on a counter. The dust around them had been wiped in clean rectangles. Someone had stocked the room recently, though not like any medical team Daniel knew. Important items were absent. Others had been placed where they looked useful rather than where a clinician would reach for them. "Who prepared this?" "You have what you need," the dark-haired man said. Daniel faced him. "No. I have a dying man and 6 people making him harder to save." The man's jaw tightened. "What do I call you?" "Marco." "Then listen, Marco. Weapons outside. 2 people in this room at most, and nobody touches the patient unless I say so. You don't give orders here." Daniel looked at Vincent, whose breathing had grown shallower during the argument. "Then stop treating me like the threat." Marco studied him, then cleared the room. Daniel leaned close enough for Vincent to hear him. "Mr. Moretti, I'm Dr. Reeves. You're at St. Catherine's. I need to examine you, and I need honest answers." Vincent's eyelids moved, but he did not respond. Marco remained at the door. The others stood beyond the glass. "Tell me what happened," Daniel said. "Restaurant on Spruce," Marco answered. "Shooter across the street. 1 round. We returned fire and moved him." "Who reached him first?" "I did. Who else?" The door opened before Marco could answer. Paul leaned in. "We all did. It was smoke and broken glass. Is he awake?" Daniel pointed into the corridor. "Out." Paul looked to Marco instead. "You heard the doctor," Marco said. Daniel began his assessment. The visible injury supported part of Marco's account, but not all of it. Vincent's condition was worse than the wound suggested. His blood pressure remained unstable. His awareness came and went too quickly. "The bullet stayed in him?" Marco asked. "I'm not discussing guesses. I need facts. You're the surgeon, which means I know when the story does not fit the patient." Marco moved closer. "Are you saying we lied?" "I'm saying somebody left something out." Daniel opened the old supply cart. A green inspection label claimed it had been checked that afternoon. Behind the first drawer, there were empty spaces where sealed equipment should have been. "This cart is incomplete. Use the counter." The counter was stocked by someone who wanted it to look prepared. Marco glanced through the glass. For the first time, uncertainty moved across his face. Daniel pointed toward the outer corridor. "There should be a sealed emergency cart beside the active trauma desk." I need it. Opening that door exposes us. Then keep this one closed and watch him die. Marco's stare hardened. Daniel did not look away. You brought him to me. Let me do the job. After a moment, Marco ordered one man to open the outer fire door. The corridor alarm sounded. Daniel heard distant voices from the working hospital. Then the door sealed again. Marco returned with the cart himself. Paul appeared behind the glass. Did he talk? Marco turned sharply. Why do you keep asking? Because I need to know if he identified the shooter. He hasn't identified anyone. Paul backed away. Daniel stored the exchange with everything else that did not fit. Vincent opened his eyes. They were dark, alert for perhaps 2 seconds, and fixed not on Daniel, but on the corridor. Are they all here? He asked. Marco stepped beside him. Everyone who left the restaurant. Vincent's gaze moved across the figures behind the glass. His mouth tightened. Daniel touched his shoulder. Do you remember falling? Vincent looked at him. Do you remember who moved you after the first shot? He tried to speak, but his focus slipped. Stay with me, Daniel said. Vincent's hand caught Daniel's wrist. His grip was weak but deliberate. You don't frighten easily, he murmured. Daniel checked the monitor. I do. I just don't let fear make medical decisions. For a few minutes, the numbers improved. The tension in Marco's shoulders eased. He looked through the glass and gave the men outside a small nod. Daniel did not share his relief. The pattern still bothered him. One shooter in front. The explanation was simple, but Vincent's body told a more complicated story. Daniel leaned over the gurney again. Vincent's monitor changed. The improvement vanished so quickly that Marco stepped forward. What happened? Daniel's hands were already moving. The injury you told me about isn't the only thing killing him. Marco looked from Daniel to Vincent. You said you could save him. I said I would treat him. If I made a mistake, you can threaten me after he survives. Daniel switched to the backup monitor when the old one began producing a broken signal. The replacement unit flickered on, warned that its battery was low, and dimmed. Plug it in, Daniel said. Marco found the cord, but the nearest outlet had been covered for renovation. Other wall. Marco moved the unit without complaint. The cable barely reached. Daniel opened the sealed cart. Its inventory sheet listed everything a trauma room was supposed to contain. 2 drawers told a different story. The cart had been signed and sealed while incomplete. Whoever prepared this room didn't expect it to work, Daniel said. Marco's eyes moved toward the dark camera. The hospital did this. The hospital didn't ask armed men to bring a patient through a service elevator. Careful. I am being careful. That is why he is still alive. Vincent's breathing changed. Daniel adjusted his approach, asking Marco for simple help. Hold this, watch that number, repeat any change aloud. He gave no explanation that could be mistaken for instruction outside that room. Marco followed each order exactly. Tell me about the street, Daniel said. I already did. You gave me a headline. I need the minute after the shot. Marco hesitated, watching Vincent. We left the restaurant through the side entrance. A shot came from a building across Spruce. Vincent went down behind the car. Where were you? At the rear door, I returned fire. Who reached him? Paul. 2 others. Then me. How long before you moved him? Maybe 30 seconds. 30 seconds is a long time when nobody is looking behind them. Marco's head turned slightly. What does that mean? It means your story has a blind spot. The procedure room handle moved. Marco crossed to the door. Stay out. Paul's voice came through the glass. The alarm changed. Is he conscious? Go back to the elevator. I'm responsible for his security. Not in this room. Marco, if he said a name, Marco struck the glass once with the flat of his hand. Paul stepped back. Daniel kept working, but the exchange settled into place beside the rescheduled security test, the dead camera, and the false inventory sheet. Too many people had prepared for Vincent Moretti to be helpless in this room. Vincent's eyes opened. His hand found Daniel's sleeve. Behind, he whispered. Marco leaned close. Behind what? Vincent tried again. The next sound might have been a name, but it disappeared under a shallow breath. The monitor warned again. Daniel eased Vincent's hand down. Don't make him talk. What did he say? You heard what I heard. He was trying to name someone, or tell us where it hurts. Guessing will not help him. Marco stared at Vincent's face, then obeyed. Daniel reviewed what the body had shown him from the moment the gurney arrived. The first injury matched a shot fired from the street. The continuing blood loss did not. The angle was wrong. The deterioration had started after the first wound should have been partly controlled. He checked Vincent again, this time looking beyond the obvious injury and the story attached to it. There it was. Not a dramatic discovery, no piece of metal catching the light, just a second path of damage, partly concealed and easy to mistake for the first in a rush transfer. Daniel felt the room narrow. Turn him enough for me to confirm something, he told Marco. Marco helped, careful now, watching Daniel's face. The second injury entered from behind. Close enough that the shooter could not have been across the street. Daniel looked through the glass. Paul stood near the elevator. The other men were spread along the corridor, each watching the room and one another. Any one of them might have been behind Vincent after he fell, or Paul's fear might have had nothing to do with the shooting. Daniel had an injury pattern, not an eyewitness. Marco saw the answer before Daniel spoke. What is it? Daniel returned his attention to the patient. The story you gave me is missing a shot. Silence held for half a breath. Then the access light beside the procedure room door flashed green. Someone outside had another key. Marco slammed his palm against the door before the lock released. The handle stopped. Who is it? Paul appeared behind the glass, holding the white access card. I heard the alarm, he said. I thought the doctor lost him. Daniel looked at the card, then at the blood dried on Paul's cuff. Neither one proved who had fired from behind. But someone in that corridor was more afraid of Vincent speaking than dying. Step away from the door, Marco said. Paul raised both hands. The access card remained between two fingers. I was trying to help. Then help from the elevator. Paul moved back slowly. The other men watched him go, and the corridor's quiet changed. Until that moment, their suspicion had been directed at Daniel. Now it had begun turning inward. Marco faced him. What did you mean? Another shot? Daniel checked Vincent's pressure before answering. It means the men outside stay outside. Marco closed the distance between them. Tell me what you found. Help me stabilize him. Now Daniel held his gaze. You can question me, or you can help him. You do not have time for both. For several seconds, Daniel was certain Marco would choose the threat. Instead, Marco returned to Vincent's side. Tell me what to do. Daniel gave him one task, then another. When Vincent's condition stopped falling, Daniel spoke quietly enough that no one beyond the glass could hear. The shot from the street was real. It was not the last one. Marco's expression did not change. The second came from behind him, Daniel continued. Close. After he was already down. Which man stood there? I wasn't on the street. You can tell from the wound. I can tell direction. I cannot give you a name. Marco looked toward Paul, then at the others. You said they surrounded him, Daniel said. Any one of them could have moved. Vincent could have turned. Smoke and broken glass change what people remember. Marco reached for the door. Daniel stepped into his path. Move. No, Marco's voice dropped. You understand what one of those men did? I understand what you will do with half an answer. You're protecting the shooter. I'm protecting the patient from a gunfight 10 feet away. Marco's hand tightened around the door handle. From the table came a weak, uneven breath. Daniel did not look back. If you open that door now, every man outside will reach for a weapon. If that happens, I cannot keep Vincent safe. Marco released the handle. Daniel returned immediately to the patient. Through the glass, Paul spoke urgently to another man. Nobody knew what Marco had learned, but they knew it was dangerous. Vincent's condition began to slip again. Whatever happens next? Daniel said, that corridor has to be empty. Marco shook his head. It weakens his security. Daniel looked at the armed silhouettes beyond the glass. One of them already got through it. Marco looked through the glass. Now he saw possible witnesses and one possible killer. If I clear them, whoever did this could walk away. If you leave them there, Vincent may not. Marco called two men to opposite outer doors, then ordered the rest beyond the elevator landing, separated and unarmed. Paul did not move. You heard him, Daniel said. Paul's eyes settled on Vincent. The boss would never agree to that. Vincent could not answer for himself. Marco opened the door only far enough to step into the corridor. "Tonight," he said. "The doctor speaks for him." The men surrendered their weapons reluctantly. Marco separated them and took the access card from Paul. When the corridor was quiet, there were no questions through the glass and no hands on the lock. The guns had moved, but the danger had not. It now wore familiar faces and waited behind closed doors. Marco seemed to understand that difference too, Marco returned. "They're clear." Daniel nodded toward the monitor. "Read that number to me if it changes." Marco did. For several minutes, neither spoke about the second shot. Daniel focused on Vincent. Marco watched every movement, the numbers steadied by degrees. Vincent opened his eyes. "Why is it quiet?" he asked. His voice was thin, but the authority in it remained. Daniel leaned closer. "Because one threat was already inside your security." Marco looked at him sharply. "Not yet." Vincent's gaze moved between them. Outside, Marco did not move. "1 minute," Vincent said. "You shouldn't be alone." Vincent's mouth pulled into something that was not quite a smile. "Then stand where I can't see you." Marco stepped through the door and remained behind the glass. Daniel checked Vincent again before speaking. "There were 2 shots. The first came from the direction your people described. The second came from behind, after you were down." Vincent watched him without blinking. "How close?" "Close enough that it did not come from across the street." "Who stood behind me?" "I don't know." "Marco knows." "Marco knows where people claim they stood." Vincent's eyes narrowed. "You're choosing your words very carefully, Doctor." "So should you." For the first time, anger reached Vincent's face. It was quiet and cold. "One of my men shot me. The evidence says someone behind you did. It does not tell me whether you turned, whether they moved, or whether the person holding the weapon is the person you suspect. Are you protecting someone?" Daniel heard raised voices beyond the outer door. The suspicion was spreading. "I'm protecting you from killing the wrong man before I finish saving you." Vincent studied him for a long moment. "And after you finish?" Vincent asked. "After I finish, you are responsible for what kind of man leaves this room." The voices outside grew louder. Something struck the metal door. Marco came back in. "They know there was a second shooter." "How?" Daniel asked. "Men notice when they're separated." Vincent lifted his hand. Marco leaned close. "No one leaves," Vincent said. "No one is questioned until I say." Marco looked surprised, but he nodded. Daniel resumed his work. The room did not become safe. It became controlled, and for that night, control was enough. Paul shouted from beyond the glass. "Vincent, I was the first one to reach you. Tell him." Vincent closed his eyes. Marco reached for the door. "No," Vincent said. It was barely audible. Marco stopped. The monitor gave another warning, less severe than before. "He is improving," Marco said. "He is responding," Daniel corrected. "That is not the same as recovered." "Can he be moved?" "Not the way you brought him in." "We cannot stay." "Then you will move him when I say, and you will move him carefully." Marco's patience thinned. "You've given enough orders." Daniel faced him, and he is alive to hear them. Vincent opened his eyes again. "Do what he says." Marco lowered his head once. The final stretch passed without a gun entering the room. Daniel did not mistake obedience for trust. Vincent listened because Daniel possessed what no one else could provide: time. When Daniel was satisfied that the immediate danger had receded, he removed his gloves and looked directly at Vincent. "You survived the operation. You have not survived the night yet." Vincent nodded toward the corridor. "Neither has someone else." Daniel held his gaze. "Not in my hospital." Marco organized the departure in stages. The men who had entered together were sent to different vehicles. Paul was kept where Vincent could see him but not speak to him. Daniel gave Marco strict limits for the transfer. Marco repeated them back without sarcasm. Vincent watched the exchange from the gurney. "What do you want?" he asked Daniel. "The active emergency department stays untouched. Nobody here gets hurt. You leave the way you came." "That isn't what I asked. It is what I want." Vincent considered him. "Most men would name a price. I treated a patient. That does not make us partners. One corner of Vincent's mouth moved. You think refusing payment keeps you innocent? Vincent asked. No. I think keeping people alive is my job. The police will ask who used this room. They should. Will you tell them? Daniel did not answer. Vincent watched the silence settle between them and understood exactly what it was worth. He reached inside his coat. Marco tensed until Vincent's hand emerged, holding a plain black card. There was no name, no company, only a phone number pressed into the paper. Daniel did not take it. Vincent placed it beside the gloves on the counter. If the world ever gives you a problem money can solve, call me. I don't want anything from you. You may not always have the luxury of wanting. Marco wheeled Vincent toward the service elevator. Before the doors closed, he looked back at Daniel. The suspicion remained, but something had changed beneath it. Daniel was no longer a disposable witness. That did not make him safer. The elevator descended. Daniel stood alone in the procedure room. Beyond the sealed fire doors, St. Catherine's continued its night. Telephones rang. Carts rolled over tile. A child cried somewhere in the active emergency department. The ordinary sounds felt impossibly close. He could report everything. He imagined police filling the corridor, questions about the men, the wound, the missing supplies, and every choice Daniel had made without consent or documentation. He also imagined those questions reaching Vincent before the hospital could protect its staff. Daniel cleaned away what would identify the patient. He did not erase the camera failure or the access history. He needed to understand those first. The black card remained on the counter. He picked it up with 2 fingers and told himself it was evidence, not an invitation. The corridor's access log should have shown Marco's stolen card and Daniel's master badge. Instead, the record began 11 minutes earlier. The cameras, fire doors, and service elevator had been placed under a maintenance override before the Morettis reached St. Catherine's. The authorization came from inside the hospital. The employee name had been replaced by a generic system account. Someone had not merely allowed the break-in, someone had prepared for Daniel to be there. When he returned to the active department, Evelyn Shaw was waiting beside the nurse's station. Were you inside the west corridor? Daniel felt the black card in his pocket, only at the outer panel. Renovation fault. It was his first direct lie to St. Catherine's. He reached home after sunrise. Claire sat at the kitchen table, fully dressed. On the table, the soup Claire had saved was untouched and cold. Daniel remembered promising he would be home before breakfast. She held out a white envelope. They didn't delay it, she said. They denied it. Daniel read the final paragraph twice. The outside appeal was exhausted. Claire had folded the page so many times that the crease had begun to tear. How long will they hold the place? He asked. 72 hours. The treatment center required a $250,000 deposit. Daniel sat across from her. He could not tell her the night had given him an answer, not without explaining the price attached to it. He removed the black card and placed it beside the denial letter, number facing up. Claire looked at it. What is that? Daniel stared at the number Vincent Moretti had given him. He did not call.